Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see everyone both in the room and in the Zoom room as well. Welcome. My name is Rachel Jones. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy here at Mason, and I'm also a member of the steering committee for the Center for Humanities Research. Thank you. Great. Sorry, we're just doing a little finessing of the sound. So thanks for your patience. Our director of the Center for Humanities Research, Alison Landsberg, unfortunately can't be with us today. So it's my very great pleasure to do my best to step into her shoes and welcome you all to today's event. It's really great to have everybody here, and we're really excited to have our amazing panelists with us as well. I'm going to keep my remarks brief, but I will just say a few things about the Center for those of you who might be new to us and joining us for the first time today. The Center was established in 2020 as one of Mason's 5 transdisciplinary centers of research for advanced study. One of our goals is to support humanities and humanities-related research by faculty and graduate students across Mason. To do that, one of the things the Center does is provide fellowships both to doctoral students and to faculty, allowing researchers at different stages of their career and different stages of their projects to come and work together as part of a cohort each semester. The Center also organizes an annual symposium focused on its annual theme. And I'm pleased to let everybody know that our 2nd annual symposium is now, we've sent out a call for papers. The theme, as for this panel and this year, is connecting and not connecting formations of community, solidarity, alienation, and antipathy. The conference will be held in April 27th to 28th. It's virtual, so wherever you are, you could take part. Our featured keynote speaker is Professor Saila Benhabib, which we're very excited about. And if you would like to submit a proposal, the deadline is the 30th of November. So perhaps that's a Thanksgiving project. We would love to have proposals from you. In addition to the fellowships and the symposium, the Center hosts a wide range of very active reading groups. It supports work by individual scholars, but also seeks to promote public humanities projects, which has resulted recently in a grant from Virginia Humanities. And it's central to its mission to promote connections across the disciplines, both at Mason and beyond, fostering interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work. The Center has hosted events connecting social sciences and humanities approaches, panels on racial justice and restorative coalition, and last year, a panel on climate change, past, present, and futures, which is very much the prologue to today's panel on connecting, not connecting in climate change, not connecting, let me start that again. Connecting and not connecting in climate justice organizing. So let me welcome you to today's event. We're delighted to have you here, and we're delighted to have our panelists with us. This event speaks very much to the mission of the Center to build bridges not only across disciplines, but with a wide range of community partners, particularly in the DC and Nova area. The event is co-hosted by the Center and the Institute for Sustainable Earth, and co-sponsored also by Cultural Studies, Integrative Studies, and the Center for Climate Change Communication. We are grateful for everybody's support in putting this event together. And I would also just like to thank briefly the key organizers whose labor and passion for this event has made it possible: Todd Stafford, Levi Van Sant, Jeremy Campbell, and Catherine Ollian. Thank you to all of you for your work and care in making today possible. And on that note, it's my pleasure to just say welcome again and open the floor to Todd Stafford, who is the Director of Communications in the Honors College and who's going to introduce our speakers in our panel today. Thank you all.
Thank you. So this event is part of a bigger series of events, the Society, Culture, and Environment events. Every first Friday of the month, you could join several of the people here in the room, others that are online, for an environmental justice reading group. And that is sponsored by the Center for Humanities Research. And we take up a lot of the kinds of questions that'll be addressed in the panel today. every third Friday of the month, you can join the Environmental Social Science Lunch Seminar, where we get to hear from one of the scholars here in our immediate community about what they've been up to and get to ask them questions. It's a nice informal lunch seminar. And so both of those are a part of the Society, Culture, and Environment series, as is this panel. And so we do want to extend thanks, of course, to the center and to the Institute for Sustainable Earth for helping to sponsor that series. And so with that, I would like to introduce our panel moderator and then our speakers. So our moderator today is Dr. Tiana Cobb. She's a postdoctoral research fellow in the communications department with co-appointments in African and African American studies and women's studies here at George Mason. Dr. Cobb is taking on a project, among others, right now that involves mental health and climate change among the African American community. And so now to our panelists. Immediately next over, we have Malini Ranganathan, Dr. Malini Ranganathan from American University, who's joining us, who's going to bring us expertise from the perspective of geography and political ecology, and has done research around the interconnections between climate justice and abolitionism, and also has been developing a concept around environmental unfreedoms that I think will be very productive in today's conversation. Next over, we have Justin Leaney. Justin Leaney formerly was the ANC for Ward 7 in Washington, D.C. That's east of the river. And Justin now is working around climate resilience issues in D.C. and helping to bring into fruition a climate resilience hub that started during his tenure as the ANC. And then finally, Carrie Fulton. Carrie Fulton is a climate organizer, writer, and communicator, all around climate justice advocate, who's going to really bring us a lot of that sort of on-the-ground expertise about what climate justice means in our region. And so with that, let's have a round of applause for our moderator and our panelists. Thank you all so much for being here.
Well, we good. Well, thank you again. Welcome to our great panel. I will just provide a brief introduction and we will jump right into this great dialogue to engage in. Just so for a quick overview, of course, we all know we're here to talk about climate justice, right? Looking at some kind of big questions here. What it is, what structures are we combating when we're looking at engaging in climate justice, and how we can organize and create solidarity together. And so jumping right into it, I'll just open the floor if anyone wants to start first. But looking at your background specifically, how do you connect to climate justice and what does that mean to you? Oh, I guess I'll start.
I love how the
Well, I appreciate that question a lot. I think so. As someone who started out really working on social justice, education, access, literacy, and especially it was an aha moment when Hurricane Katrina hit, because it connected a lot of the environmental renewable energy policy work that I had done. You know, if anyone has ever been you ever been to the grocery store, this person is like, you have a moment for the environment? That was me, like for a summer. And it did not connect at all. And I was like, this is horrible. And I don't want to talk about turbines anymore. And then Hurricane Katrina hit. And the way that I was able to go down, I was an undergrad at Howard, and I was able to go to the Gulf Coast and to the areas that were most impacted. We were in Biloxi and we were also in 940 Northern. And it was not only brave, but also an aha moment, because I realized that what happened in New Orleans could happen to me as a people that have people that look like me. It could happen right here in DC, it could happen in where I live now. It could happen. So we're getting a little bit of our Zoomies are having trouble hearing.
It's okay. My mic sounds nice. There we go. There you go. Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, so that was a big aha moment for me, but also thinking about it from a framework of how do you connect to climate justice? We all connect to climate justice because we all are existing on this planet and we're all watching these things change. We all just sat through mid 70-degree weather in November and it was beautiful, but also awkward. So those are some of the different ways. I also think that we were having this conversation about what's the difference between environmental justice and climate justice, and we can dive deeper into that. But there are these actual aspects of what our future will look like and what that means for your zip code, what that means for your census tract, what that means for your demographic. And so in all ways, I know that because of who I am, me and people who look like me will be hurt first and worst by climate change and policies that are being put in place right now. So there is a deep connection because one, I want to see a future where my son can live in a healthy environment. And I oftentimes ask people where they'll be in 2050. And in 2007, when I first started asking that question, 2050 felt so far away. And now it's literally around the corner. So, you know, where will you be in 2050? What do you want that to look like? And I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. Justin Leaney here. I became an advisory neighborhood commissioner in 2015. I served a neighborhood in Northeast Washington, D.C. called Kenilworth Parkside. By many measures, an environmental justice community in terms of exposures to toxics, exposures to poor air quality and high elevated levels of adult asthma due to the proximity of a highway. A predominantly African-American community, but also a very resilient, very self-reliant community. Before I was an advisory neighborhood commissioner, I never envisioned that I would be an activist of any kind. I am sort of inherently a bit of a quiet person, and never been one to really raise my voice a whole lot. But I was recruited by my neighbors to serve as an elected representative for the community, and I went in with an open mind and an idea that I would approach this by building relationships and understanding my neighbors. And I very quickly understood that we had many, you know, that we were living with a legacy of decisions that were made decades before, and that people were still paying for today. But even then, I was an environmental justice and equity person because that's what the community needed. I didn't really connect with the climate issue. I mean, I was aware of it, but it didn't really hit home to me until I was at a presentation in 2018 when the Silver Jackets had done a study on the creek that ran through my community. It's a creek that's prone to flash flooding. And they had done a study of how increased rainfalls due to climate change would change flooding, how it would alter the floodplain, how it would alter the frequency of flooding, and increase the risk for the community. And in my neighborhood, there's a large apartment complex, or a pair of large apartment complexes inhabited by approximately 2,000 people right on that creek. And when they put that map up on a PowerPoint screen and it said, oh, well, an event that's going to put a couple feet of water in these apartment units, that's going to be it's going to be a 25-year event, not even a 100-year floodplain event, a 25-year event. And it immediately made me think of Katrina. I'm like, we're going to have a disaster in this community, very short order, unless someone does something about it. And it's a predominantly African-American community that has had environmental justice issues on it for decades. So people in the community need to know about this. We need to act on it. We need to act now. Otherwise, no one's going to do anything about it because that's not how this community has been served previously. So that's how I got involved with climate, and worked towards worked with DC government and other community leaders to So bring forward a resilience hub in the community. So it's very much based on the relationships that I have with my neighbors and how it will affect them really directly and as you said, very imminently. This is not really very far in the future. And this was a disaster that people by and large, did not know about. So I will pass it on to you.
So I came to academia from activism, but international activism. In the early 2000s, I was protesting the World Bank eyeing the water sectors of many developing countries. And in the city that I was at the time, Bangalore in southern India, the World Bank was very interested in introducing neoliberalism in the water sector through market-oriented reforms. Anyway, eventually I landed up in an academic career and I was an urban geographer, and I landed up at American University in Washington, DC in 2013. And I was pretty struck by the fact that our students at AU graduate, knowing about the history of colonialism and extractive development in the global South, but they really don't know much about the history of racial segregation and redlining and disinvestment in their own backyards in Washington, DC. And they could be as far away, socially and politically from what's happening in DC as they are physically from a slum in southern India. And so for me, I started thinking about, well, why do we always think about America as this exceptional case, right? As this case of like, somehow, it doesn't fit the model of underdevelopment or of colonial political relations. And one of my colleagues at AU, Eve Bratman, a dear friend of mine, had just written an article in the Third World Quarterly, which is a really prominent left academic social science journal. And it was called Development's Paradox, DC as a Third World City, which really was intriguing. And I teamed up with her and I said, let's do a project together on environmental injustices, but really go deep, really think about the sort of historical legacies of why DC is an apartheid city. What is its colonial relation with the federal government, right? And how is this impacting environmental vulnerabilities? And trained in the political ecology literature, right? The way that climate vulnerability is defined is that it sort of refers to the fact that those least responsible for climate change bear its greatest impacts, right? And therefore climate justice identifies and seeks to redress the social, historical, and structural causes of climate-induced harm that in the US at least, right, is disproportionately borne, as you just heard, by low-income, brown, Black, Indigenous people and their intersectional social locations, whatever they may be. And so applying some of that political ecology literature to looking at Washington, DC, it was imperative to look at sort of the underlying and historical causes of food insecurity, of extreme health disparities, the fact that there's no trauma center in Ward 7 and 8. People actually have to go across the river to get emergency medical help in certain sort of times of the day. High asthma rates, right? There, so and why? What are the reasons for these extremely disproportionate harms there? And then how are those harms going to be exacerbated by an extreme weather event? And that was our entry point into looking at climate injustice in Washington, DC. And so we got a small grant called Tackling Urban Vulnerability, Lessons for Community Resilience and Climate Justice in Washington, DC. And that's when I began my research. And in 2015, shortly after Justin was elected as ANC rep, I met him and learned a lot about what was going on in Ward 7 and ended up spending several years studying kind of the historical causes of climate harm in that part of the city, but then also came across Carrie's wonderful work on climate organizing in the city, particularly around the People's Climate March in 2017. So that's kind of how I came to the issue. A little bit more globally circuitous, but very, very thought it was very important to sort of shed that light and turn the camera around and have it focus on the US as also a case study. Yeah.
Thank you for that. You brought it around full circle, completely at the end there, didn't she? It was good. But you all or each came to climate justice
from your specific backgrounds that are different, but then brought you all together to addressing this one specific issue. And as we know with like social justice and specifically climate justice, as we're talking here, there are these systems and these structures that we are essentially fighting against and trying to unlearn certain behaviors or address certain policies. Can you talk a bit about what are these systems? What are these structures specifically, or who are these people that we are fighting against in trying to achieve climate justice or addressing these climate injustices?
Yeah, sorry about that. Sometimes for the people in the Zoom, sometimes we're fighting ourselves. A lot of times when it comes to climate change, there can be a pessimism that comes over it. It's like a dark cloud. And I've heard so many people say like, well, the world is about to end. I shouldn't even have a kid. I should just like not focus on that. YOLO, why save money? There's this daunting situation where people have become apathetic, and we have to fight that within ourselves. We have to fight that within other people. And there's like this possibility, the possibility that we can actually make a difference, which oftentimes when you are dealing with systems that have habitually oppressed you and have shown you that they do not want to focus in on your communities where there are disproportionate impacts, people just get jaded and they're like, well, what is the point? Or we're going to focus on this one thing that's dividing us rather than the multiple things that should be uniting us. Like climate change should not be a political issue. In a lot of other countries, it's not a political issue. But when you connect it to access to resources, when you connect it to where you're going to be able to live, where you're not going to be able to live, we even connect it to population control. All of these things become very, very political and politicized. So we have to first, and it's interesting because almost, a lot of the main campaigns that I've worked on have to deal with voter engagement, have to deal with election protection. And that's not just on a federal level, but also on a localized level. So if we can't get enough votes in these districts, then that means that that voice will not be at the table. Right now, we're literally trying to push Congress, and not even just the full Congress, literally like maybe one or two Congress members that are holding it hostage a little bit. And then there's this whole other side that's got a block state, but we won't talk about that. But literally, we are trying to fight to have policies that will invest in infrastructure that's necessary to protect communities. And people have said, that's too much. We don't want to do that. Why are we doing that for those people? And that is what we're fighting against. We have to fight against people saying those people. We're all people. If a bridge break, we all break, So that's what we're fighting against.
So well said. My thoughts are sort of build off of that a little bit. In my experience, one of the biggest struggles was getting people to recognize that the community that I live in exists. It's in DC. I think it's so common. DC, I think, in many ways is very progressive and inclusive, but in other ways, I think when you hear the term east of the river DC, and that is a whole portion of the district that is home to about 144,000 people. But it also consists of dozens of different neighborhoods and communities with different challenges and interests. So one of the greatest challenges I encountered as a community advocate and still encounter from time to time is just getting through to people that we exist. Also getting through what the nature of the problems are and and really pushing to get people to understand that these challenges and problems we are struggling to overcome didn't happen by accident. These were deliberate decisions made by people before, and that resources need to be put into them to correct them now before they continue to magnify and grow. Yeah, I think of an experience I had a while back when I was advocating for some transit equity some years back. I wrote an article and published it, and what it was is there was going to be a cut in train service that had disparate impact on my community, on a lot of minority communities in the DC area, and the top theme of the comments in response to it were, why are we even talking about this? Why are we talking about disparate impact of transit cuts? We should just be talking about how we need to advocate for more money. So it's literally people, maybe they don't want to see what's in front of them, or there's an incentive, right? If you're going to argue for more money and you have to split the pie with other people, I think there's always the challenge that those people are going to take some of the money from you. So I think building coalitions is one of the best ways to overcome that. I'm going to pass it on to you.
So I think who or what we're fighting against, and I've increasingly come to realize this, is really predatory economic actors, right? And I use the term predatory because I truly believe that there has been wealth concentration and accumulation through literally, predatory kinds of actions that squeeze wealth, squeeze the opportunity for intergenerational wealth transfer from certain groups. And that's increasingly concentrating in a few hands. And it's the same sort of process that you see happening in housing, in banking and debt relations, in energy. I was just listening the other day to an energy justice advocate who talked about energy companies preying on low-income consumers, where they're sort of duped into believing that their energy bills are going to be lowered, but after a few months, their energy bills actually go out the roof. And they knew this all along, but they're still selling them something, without full transparency. In DC, real estate is predatory, right? It is predatory. You have places like Congress Heights where slumlords, which is for me very interesting because that's the term used to refer to landlords that are rapacious, will on purpose not fix leaky faucets, on purpose not fix moldy roofs, right? Rat infestations, roach infestations, which of course are really bad for asthma. And as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, right, who's an abolitionist geographer, very well known in the anti-carceral state organizing sphere, these are issues that are really robbing people of their life chances. And so why those housing problems don't get fixed is because they want to drive people out so they can turn around that housing for market rate housing. Okay, in terms of land relations, there are predatory relations. So it's corruption by another name. The system is sort of rigged this way, but I really do believe that we need to focus on those sorts of extreme economic abuses of the system. And then that's what we're really up against, which then have ramifications for racial capitalism, right? Which is the reproduction of both, racial inequalities and class inequalities in extremely inextricable ways. So, I mean, that's of course my maybe large meta view talking there, but I can give more examples to connect that meta view with, I think, more micro culprits here.
But that really helps, right? To hear some of these meta views or some of these even if once we bring in theory and things like that, and connecting it to some of these specific instances or experiences that are actually going on at the community level that some of us may just be separated from, right? One of the things I've learned as a researcher and even in my classroom and teaching is that in order for us to achieve any type of justice, we have to know specifically what it is. We have to name the specific problem that we're trying to address before we can even address it, right? But one of the pitfalls I coming up in my younger days have learned is you can't do it alone, right? Sometimes you feel very overwhelmed and you want to learn who else is out here trying to help. What are other people doing? And so can you speak a little bit to the importance of creating solidarity around climate justice and organizing? And as you mentioned, coalitions, like what is the role here? And how do we go about achieving that?
Okay. All right. All right. So coalitions are critical. I think that one, there's always, you know, if anybody's ever read the book Stone Soup, right? When a kid goes and he has like the stone and he has the idea that he's hungry and he wants to eat and he just goes around and he starts getting more ingredients from everybody in the neighborhood until they're able to have soup, right? And in a lot of ways, coalition building is like that. You don't necessarily have all the components, but when you work together, you can make something awesome. And when you don't have strong coalitions, then it makes it for even easier for other entities to divide and conquer. And I think about that a lot when I think about what it means to keep a coalition together. And that part is where oftentimes historically you'll have different divisive things that happen. And sometimes it can be something financial, like a group got more money than another group, and this group is struggling and that group is thriving. Who got, credit versus who didn't get credit. But then also sometimes the division can be communication. And so when you're building a coalition, it's so critical, especially right now when people I feel like are hypersensitive to how we communicate with one another because we're communicating more than we've ever done before. We're literally on a Zoom. You people would not have been here like 15 years ago, maybe 10, who even knows, right? But we're communicating in a way that's, and not, listen to me, you people, we're all people together. But I say that to say, without having strong communication, without thinking about being able to feel free to be a little raggedy at times, you can't build strong coalitions. And also being honest about where you're coming from. I think that there's always this space that happens where if you're not in it, but you're watching it, you may want to support, but sometimes you may not know the best way to do that support. So it's always important to take off that expert hat because you're not the expert anymore. This isn't even something you understand, but you are an ally. You are someone who can support. You are someone who can listen and assist. And I think that is oftentimes the hardest thing for folk to do because we all really want to be right. And sometimes being right means us all working together to figure out how these spices mix together. So, yeah.
I see the value in coalitions in a couple levels. There's the intellectual value of you connect with other people who have like interests and you become stronger because of it. But I think back at my experience working in the community, and I think there's a real human factor to it. You support each other, you're there for each other. I think it's what makes the activity sort of rewarding in terms of your life, right? These are your I think to a degree when you can, you build those relationships, you spend time with those people, you become a part of each other's lives. I think so much in this world we communicate without really connecting. And I think part of the value of building the coalitions is really to build those relationships, to really internalize that. I like how you talked about how how you take off your expert hat because you're not always right. I think one of the most valuable things about building coalitions is when you connect with people who really, have experience different than yours, sometimes they could really awaken you to the blinders in your experience. I've been corrected on a number of occasions by sort of the neighborhood elders, but sometimes by young people who've corrected me for and called me out for kind of having my blinders and being in my own world a little bit. So I think not only is the value in getting the work done, but it's in uplifting each other and being there for each other. And that's one of the most, I think that's probably the only way to really maintain the personal sort of resilience and energy and stick-to-itiveness that you need to really persevere with any of these actions, because none of the stuff changes overnight. And you need to have people you can help carry forward and who can help carry you forward and to connect yourself to it on a human level. Otherwise, it becomes work and you get tired and you don't want to do it anymore and you drift off and do something else.
That was really nicely said. I think apart from the human connection side of things, I truly believe the environmental movement will fail if it isn't going to build coalitions. The environment movement will fail if it's just a group of environmentalists, traditionally defined, sitting around talking about how to, conserve endangered species or conserve biodiversity. I mean, this has historically been the problem with the environmental movement, is it's very white, cis male, led. And of course, that's changed in good deal because of the people of color movement and conference that was held, about 2-3 decades ago, and the movement starting from the U.S. South with the work of Robert Bullard and others. And we know that it's come a long way, but it still has a lot to do. And so the coalition building, of course, isn't just around representation, but also it has to be multi-movement and cross-movement building. And so, I also have been very concerned and doing research and activism on issues around protesting fascism in India, because there's a Hindu nationalist government in power there. And, some of the sort of struggles around ethno-nationalism and white nationalism that you have in the US, you have, but in a different guise in India. But one thing that's really inspired me is the way that labor unions, women's groups, sanitation workers, industrial laborers have kind of come together, poets, artists, have come together to call out discrimination, to call out human rights abuses, to call out the kind of corporate capture of the economy, especially around food and agriculture. And so that kind of cross-sectoral, cross-movement, unlikely, maybe even opponents at some point, like industrial workers and folks with the environmental movement coming together and talking under a tent, finding commonalities and languages that kind of resonate. I mean, it will not survive unless we have that going forward. And there's a great piece that Jedediah Purdy wrote a few years ago called "Environmental Justice Was Once a Social Justice Movement," which I teach to my undergrads because it's very pithy and it really gets the point across, which is that, if you think about it, environmental justice organizing started with kind of the long civil rights history and Latinx farm workers organizing against pesticides in California under Cesar Chavez's farm workers movement, Martin Luther King protesting with hooking arms with sanitation workers with the Memphis sanitation struggle and demand for occupational safety. People were losing their lives and not and limbs and not compensated at all, very poor worker safety. So it was about questions of worker safety, questions of labor dignity, questions of, essentially, being human that were centered that we might have lost sight of over the last few decades, honestly. And so coalition building is not just a feel-good thing. I think it's a matter of survival. I mean, I truly think that the environmental movement will not go.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking about it, and it kind of goes back to the old thing where you have really strict environmental laws, but your laws about other humans aren't very strict. So it's you'll stop building this thing because a bird built a nest in the crane, but you won't stop building a project, even though it knocks down all my neighbors' houses. Yeah, I think one of my experiences in working in the community is there's always a human connection. There's always another connection to the environmental work, but also to the community challenges. They're all kind of the same thing. I think it's a matter of being always having to find where the threads connect.
Only other thing I would say is that one, definitely, if you haven't already, there's these sets of principles. So Melina mentioned the principles of environmental justice when she mentioned the People of Color Leadership Forum that happened in 1991. And those are key. And it showcases really a dialogue of how coalition has worked in EJ because it's intersectional. But also there's the Hermes principles for working together. And a lot of organizations, including Climate Justice Alliance, who I worked with and is still very strong allies with, utilize in a lot of their organizing. And so that's a key and critical component. And as people who are thinking about becoming professionals in this area, it's also key to know some of those guiding principles as you're building coalition.
Yeah, thank you for that. So as we build coalitions, right, or we organize, you mentioned how it's important for us to connect with people who may not always go through the same experiences or may not always be experts within the area. Like these connections are important, right? But these connections bring challenges because we all, especially when we come from different backgrounds, we don't always see eye to eye, especially when we're tackling an issue as large as climate justice. Can you share like an experience that y'all have had with one of these challenges? I know, Carrie, you talked a little bit about it, and how, you overcame that.
Yeah, I feel like there's always some very interesting challenges when you're bringing people together in coalition. One of the, I think, critical aspects when I'll go back to a throwback. When we first started having these conversations and we were bringing together college students from different campuses across the country. And we had a conference with schools in the South. And we wanted to do some caucus breakouts, right? A lot of times different conferences will have those. They'll have like affinity group breakouts, here we go meet as white people and y'all go meet as people of color, which is also a problematic term because it just lumps all of us into like this box over here. Like, here is all the colored Skittles and here's the white licorice versions of the Mike and Ike's. Like, I don't know, what is this, So it just feels very disconnected and also doesn't take into account the dynamics and the complexities of being culturally different within a United States framework. What also happens is that people get mad. What do you mean I have to sit and meet with white people? What are y'all gonna talk about? And there's always, no matter what, there's somebody who comes in and they're like, I snuck into the POC working group and I want to tell you what I found out. And it's like, how did you get in? It's like, you just told everybody you was light skinned. That's how you got in. And that's like a frustrating process because it takes away from why people are doing that in the first place, and people immediately get uncomfortable with the idea of race and what we have to unpack. There's also the reality of I've seen those go really, really, really bad. I always tell people, if you're going to walk into having these conversations, you got to be able to close that door once you're done. And it's not to say that these issues won't come up over and over again, but you have to be able to come back together and talk about it. Make that space within your conventions, within your conferences. If you break out into ally groups, make sure you have another space where everyone can come together and really talk amongst each other. And that was really powerful because that was the conflict that happened where people were very upset because someone had crashed the POC group, right? And then there was another group that was like, we're boycotting. We don't want to meet with ourselves. Like, why are we having these separate meetings? We don't want to have that. Then there was like different breakouts where you had multiracial breakouts where people said, hey, I don't really know where I fit in this space. So we're going to have our own breakout, right? So what happened at the end of that is that all the facilitators, at the end, we brought people together. And we had to have these really critical conversations. And what was even more important about that is that we were doing this at Valdosta State in Georgia, right? So there are major collaborations, and there are people who were at that conference that still organize together, that still grow together. And I think that what was oftentimes happen is that people get scared of conflict. So they get very conflict avoidant. And when you become conflict avoidant, you create all these new conflicts that just never needed to happen if y'all would have just sat down and had a moment to talk amongst each other. So that is one thing that I would say is a challenge. And this happens even more so once you get into the professional realm and people's jobs are on the line based off of how this interaction happens, based off of if you can meet this deliverable, based off of all these different things. So creating space within your organizing to make room for conflict, not being afraid of conflict, because conflict is where change happens. Conflict is where the real conversation happens, where you can break it down and say, that was your issue. You just was mad because there was mayonnaise on your sandwich. Like, we could have taken care of that, but we can't take care of it if we don't talk to each other.
You're always so hard to follow after, I gotta say. Oh, yeah. I was gonna say, I think there's a couple of examples of challenges in coalition building that I've been involved with. When I first got involved with the neighborhood, there had been a discussion about development that had happened some years before. And they had built a coalition of representatives from 4 different neighborhoods or so. Everyone had come together, and the meeting had ended up with everyone storming out. The person who ran the meeting locked the door, and they weren't going to offer the space anymore. So a lot of my time early in the community was just connecting to these folks and talking to them and understanding where they came from, and then really just focusing on where we had things in common, and knowing that you just can't walk some places with some people, but you can walk a lot of the way with them. And everyone, I think you just got to be okay with that. And I think you got to state that in the relationship. We don't have to agree about everything. We can disagree. We can't go everywhere together, but we can go most places together, or some places. But that takes time. I think it involves building a lot of time into your work to build those relationships, to nurture those relationships, because you have to build some trust for that to happen first. If people don't trust each other, it doesn't take very much to blow up the whole coalition or relationship. And so you got to be proactive about addressing the trust issues. I think some of the ways I did that in the community was to be extremely transparent about what I was about, transparent about what I was going to do, transparent about who I was meeting with, transparent about what we were going to talk about. And you would always bring people with you, because in a lot of communities, like, rumors will spread fast. I mean, that's the that's the world we've been living in for the last 6 years or so. Rumor takes on a life of its own and becomes truth to a degree. So you got to be proactive about being transparent and addressing that stuff up front. And you got to be willing to chase people sometimes. I recently had a challenge in a group I'm involved with. I'm going to try to be vague so no one feels pointed out, where the person was like, I don't feel like I'm being heard here. I don't think people are going to go with anything I want to do. So I think I'm done. I'm going to walk away. And I really had to spend some time with this person to tell them, to really let them know that I at least valued them. I can't speak for the other people in the group, but to express, and I did value their contributions, even though the contributions come from a very different perspective. And that's valuable though, right? If everyone's on the same perspective, why even bother talking? So I think you really have to value those differences and let people know that they are valued. Otherwise, that goes back to that whole trust thing. Then they don't feel valued, they don't feel trusted, or don't see trust, they're going to walk away.
I want to pick up on one part of your question, which was to think about dissonances or disconnects between what academics or students, policymakers, et cetera, might be talking about. For instance, something like climate justice, and then the kinds of experiences and words and frameworks and languages that people on the ground actually use. And I think climate is one of those things that has quite a bit of disconnect, right? So in here or in fora, we talk about climate justice, but that's not necessarily, and this is what an organizer, Angela Doyne, in Ward 7 told me. She said, climate justice is not on the horizon of most people, right? It's about getting food on the table. It's about keeping your job, right? It's about getting healthcare. It's about having enough at the end of the month to pay for medical bills, et cetera, right? And so the here and the now kind of overshadows any sort of long-term thinking about climate justice. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And so something that I've really learned is that you have to kind of find those points of convergence and those terms that actually stick and bring people together, right? Sometimes they're called boundary concepts, like those concepts that bring more people to the table than alienate. And so it was really interesting. So Angela Doyne and I sat down at one point, and she's like, a lot of people in Ward 7 aren't thinking about climate change and climate justice, and he introduced me to someone. She said, Bruce Parnell is talking about trauma, and he's talking about how people have to confront and heal historical trauma. And this is especially major in African-American communities where, trauma is often passed down generationally. And so he actually works with both. So Bruce Parnell, who I've written about in an article, profiled his life. I actually wrote about his abolitionist ancestry as well. He comes from 5 generations of people who were involved in the Underground Railroad and station masters, and really incredible ancestry and genealogy. But he works on the trauma that is both embodied and kept sort of in the bones and hearts of seniors, but also kids, because kids also experience trauma. And you talk about mental health and climate change recently, right? Like, and that's something that you might be interested in. Mental health is, of course, one of the outcomes that people are now connecting with climate change. But of course, there's all these other reasons that people are experiencing poor mental health. And so trauma then, it was like a word that was not on my radar. And I started thinking about that so deeply, and about how can we reorient the conversation so that we're not alienating people with our words, right? And so I started using the term more. I started investigating, transformative justice and healing kind of conversations. What does that mean? What does it mean to de-escalate violence so that you don't have police always, on your heels in the neighborhood, that you can actually take care of issues, by talking it out. And of course, communities that are very over-policed also tend to be very, very amongst the most vulnerable to heat waves because they don't have enough green cover. There's all kinds of compounding issues. And so policing, it turns out, is a really important issue in a lot of climate vulnerable and environmental justice communities. So that's an example of where I think I learned a lot, and I felt very humbled about being someone who, knew the books, knew the theory, but didn't really have a sense of what vocabulary actually describes lived experience. And so that's one of them. And then very quickly, the other term that I find very interesting and a bit controversial is resilience. So a resiliency, right? Depending on how you want to say it. But I don't know if you all read, at the time of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Tracy Washington, who's a well-known organizer and lawyer in Louisiana, said, "Don't call me resilient." And that was a kind of, it went viral. She actually made little posters of it, and she stuck it on trees and stuff, and built billboards around New Orleans. And what she meant by that was like all these outside experts and FEMA and federal government and technical experts, and were coming in and saying, "Oh, New Orleans is a really resilient community." And she said, what that does is it just shifts the buck, it passes the blame, right? It's like buck passing, where it's like we're constantly the ones who are expected to recover. We're constantly the ones who are expected to withstand, harm and compounding injustices. So don't call me resilient. And I think it was politically very provocative. On the other hand, people in climate vulnerable communities sometimes do find the word resilient, and they do use it in their vocabulary. So I think what this means is that it behooves us to listen very carefully and usually shut up and listen to the way people use words.
That speaks to me as a as a communication studies person, focusing on the intentionality of the words that we are using, especially coming from a research background. We go into these communities really with a bit of elitism in trying to tell them what they need, rather than coming in and listening and letting them tell us what is going on, what are the issues, what are some possible ways we could solve them, really pushing to be culture-centered or community-centered within a lot of this work and a lot of this organizing that we're doing. And I know I've been saying thank you a lot this whole time, but I'm serious. It's very profound. I want to leave enough time for us to engage in some discussion with the audience. But as a person, I do mental health work and specifically communication work. And the project I'm on, looking at climate change and looking at climate justice, really opened my eyes to how profound it is for us to not only join or create coalitions interdisciplinarily, but also with community organizers, with politicians, with policymakers, and to really get this out here. So thank you so much for all the knowledge and all that you've shared with us. And here we will open the floor to questions. Do you want me to go? Okay.
So is there anyone in the room with a question that would like to start us off?
I'll ask. I was hoping students would ask first. I'm not a student, but fantastic conversation. What I wanted to ask, because it's been something I've been thinking about when you were talking, and it was a nice juxtaposition at the very beginning. You started with what are we fighting against, and then how are we building coalitions? And I've been thinking about and working in how do we build coalitions with things that we're fighting against, like when we are, and I should say I'm coming from more climate than justice, but often industry has said, those are the bad actors and we have to fight against them. And I'm like, well, they might have solutions and we need to pull them in and work with them to co-create solutions, find solutions that are acceptable for all of us, rather than trying to eradicate sort of the bad actor, if you know what I mean, change the bad actor rather than eradicate. And so I wanted to, in the theme of of this is connecting, disconnecting, like how do you engage in that sort of, when do you bring in coalition? When do you bring those types of actors into the coalitions, or when do you step away and act, disconnect?
That's a really important question. And I think it's a question that organizations grapple with all the time. And it also has to deal with, what are you trying to get done? If your main goal is just to transition to renewable energy as the primary source of how we get our energy, then you might bring industry in a little bit earlier. But if your main priority is to eradicate systems that are oppressive and that are based off of corporate structures that have historically harmed and not benefited your community, you might bring them in a little bit later, because your goal ultimately is not necessarily about renewable energy. It's about justice for communities and people. So I don't want a world where I have wind turbines and solar panels, but there's still injustice, where, you know, we've created all these systems, but there's no job opportunities, nowhere for people to connect to. And then there's the other aspects of what do you mean by industry? So are we talking about the executives of BP and Exxon, or are we talking about the workers of BP and Exxon? And, you know, those conversations become very nuanced too, because then you ask, are we talking about the union workers, or are we talking about the at-will workers? And those are two different conversations. So I think when we talk about bringing in any industry or any group, we have to think about the different levels and also what our main goal is.
Having come from working in the community, you almost never have all the resources you need. So I used to call it being opportunistic. So you look for opportunities to solve your problems with another resource, or to connect them together. And sometimes that means working together with people who you don't particularly care for. A classic one in DC, since you mentioned real estate earlier, I think, is in DC, we have these processes where development goes through the zoning commission, but there's the advisory neighborhood commissioners get to have a say in that process. So they get to weigh in. And in communities like mine, well, in communities across the district, this is always a very controversial, always a very challenging process. People like their communities the way they are. They don't necessarily want to see a whole lot of change. But in communities that are under-resourced, development projects can also be an opportunity to make a partnership to bring resources into the community to solve the problems. But it's not something that can be done very easily, right? Because it goes back to the whole trust thing. There are so many, I know of so many people who went off and had a conversation somewhere with a developer, and then something happened in the neighborhood, but no one knows what deal was made or what amount of acquiescence, what it cost the community. So I think you can find those opportunities to work together, but you have to be really clear about who you are, what you're willing to do, and what you have done, and also to bring some of your friendly coalition members along to sort of vouch and so everyone can understand what exactly happened. It requires a lot of transparency if you're going to cross the aisle, so to speak, because trust in our current day is something that is in short supply.
Well, two really fabulous answers. I really appreciate what Carrie said about not thinking of industry as monolithic and thinking about the workers and executives, as actors whose interests might pull in really different directions. And for me, I think the term track record here is really important. And so if it's about building partnerships, with business actors or with industry, it's really about, well, what is their track record? Sure. Does it show a cooperative economic model? Does it show a kind of, really sort of good hiring practices, good labor practices, right? And so, companies are not going to change overnight. And so they have to demonstrate that trust, exactly as you said, first, before community groups, I would imagine, would be willing to sit at a table with them. And that's for very good reason. The Black Worker Center at 1DC is all about cooperative economic models. And it's not about throwing out business, even though they do come at it from a pretty Marxist standpoint. It's about that sort of, wealth redistribution and thinking about how to build strong, sustainable futures for future generations, right? But through that cooperative model. So I think that stuff is really creative, and it's a heterodox economics that has promise. I'm just not sure that the really concentrated industry with a whole lot of power and wealth for instance, the fossil fuel industries have that track record. I just don't think they do.
I think also you have to be able to demand a partnership, right? To a degree, like if it's someone so wealthy and so powerful that they can roll over you, why would, there's not really any way you can sort of compel good behavior. And I think you need the reciprocity in order for anything to function.
Do you have any online questions? Okay, and so we're going to take a question or two from online.
All right, so we have, I was hoping you could speak a bit more about how you cultivate relationships of accountability to each other in your organizing spaces. Couple in a row?
Yeah.
We've just got one other one. Go ahead and start with that one, and I can do that after.
All right. In my case, the transparency is the baseline for it. So you have to say what you're going to do and then actually do the thing. And you have to be willing to hold each other to account for that. I think you also have to be really willing to meet people halfway too, when they bust your chops because you've gotten out of line. I've had that happen many times.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely on that point, and also when we talk about that building, was it systems of accountability? Is that what the question said?
Relationships of accountability.
Relationships of accountability. Yeah, I think we touched on this a little bit as far as being okay with conflict, and not seeing it as something that has to be avoided at all costs. I think that there are some spaces, and it's very interesting because I think I've had the opportunity to work with a variety of different organizational and coalition structures. And there is a tendency, I think, in movement spaces to have more emotional communication, whereas in more corporate structures, it's like a very direct communication, which can be interesting because I think, and this might sound bad, but in a lot of ways, you have to figure out your best hybrid for that. And being able to have good tracking of like, hey, let me go back and say, this is what I've been able to do. Like, check this email, because we live in a world where rumors happen a lot. And when you're building in coalition, it's very easy for elephant telephone to happen. That's why I think having that clarity can be really helpful.
Just quickly, I think it helps to be very honest about what your skills and strengths are and what your weaknesses and limitations are in any partnership, right? And so just knowing what those are and then being able saying that I will be able to bring this to the relationship. But these things I actually don't really know how to do. I'm willing to learn through the partnership. It'll take a while. I think really knowing what those are helps and goes a long way.
I think I can actually probably stay on this mic. That'll be a little easier. So do we have another room question or should I take? Yes, please.
Thank you. Okay. Well, first of all, I wanted to say I really, really liked everybody's conversations. I'm not a big climate change person. The only reason I got into climate change is because of my professor. And that's probably the only reason I'm here, but that's okay. I'm very much like I'm very much the computer science nerd who would tend to stay in our own space. So a lot of the things you guys were saying was about conflict and transparency and stuff, being honest with your skills. I was wondering, since a lot of people are kind of like in their own space, like tunnel vision, how would you kind of shift their perspective a little bit to kind of be honest? Because it's kind of not hard. It's because you could say that stuff and then not do it. So I was just wondering, how would you help shift somebody to kind of open their mind a little bit?
Anybody want to start?
Well, I truly believe in the power of storytelling. I don't think throwing a bunch of facts and figures at students, let alone activists, let alone elders, community members, is going to change people's hearts and therefore minds about environmental catastrophe and climate change. So, storytelling, and climate advocates are the first to say this, really, but it's bringing to life and bringing to life in a way that's not distant and like, oh, said person in Bangladesh is drowning, but really much closer to home. And we were talking about this earlier at lunch, but one of the ways that you get people out of their tunnel vision is to talk about health, because everybody actually cares about health, right? And most people know somebody who has some sort of lung issue, asthma issue, right? It's getting more and more common, or other types of issues. And so health is one of those things that I think is like a boundary concept I was talking about earlier that brings a lot of different people to the table. So, so for me, that's how you get people out of their small, tunnel vision areas.
I have a really good story from when I first got involved with the Resilience Hub in DC. The District Department of Environment and Energy had brought together a group of people from around Ward 7 to advise on these policies that DC has on, or plans on climate and resilience. And the environment people came into the room and they're like, well, we're going to talk about resilience today and environmental issues. And everyone said, well, but that's not really what we care about. And so they said, well, really, we're worried about unemployment because our community has a lot of unemployment. People don't have a lot of economic opportunities. We worry about health was another big one, public safety. So we had to have a dialogue. It took some time to really relate these topics together, but there were cross-connecting, you call them linkages, but really there were ways that we could connect, or there were ways we eventually connected the resilience and the climate plans to helping solve these community identified issues. So sort of when I talk about being opportunistic, in a sense, you need to take some time to get to know what the person cares about and then relate to that, make the connection with them so that they can make the connection with climate.
I agree with that. I also, I was having a conversation with someone. I was like, this information is interesting, it's helpful, but it's not useful. And I really am a big advocate for useful information, especially like we need lots of computer science people. We need people who are willing to geek out on research and then send it to people. There are billions of dollars in grants and funding that is being allocated to communities right now. And the biggest issue is that most people don't have time to do all that research. So if there are we definitely need computer science people. Like, Python? What's up? How are you? How you doing? So I think there's a way for everybody to connect. And also, like you just mentioned, like, how do we make this of use to you? Sometimes there's things where like, I feel like my son is not paying attention at all. And then later on down the line, he'll be like, yeah, no, I totally got that. And also there's that part. So so any help on what's best and useful, especially for Generation Z. And then I don't even know what generation he is, like Alpha. I don't even know. But yeah, that would be super helpful.
Oh, yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Another thing I've learned is that you have to embody your expectations for other people, and you have to lead your life that way. And so if we are building these coalitions or organizing with other people and we're expecting them to be authentic or we're expecting them to be accountable, we need to do that first and foremost. Because a lot of times we have expectations of other people, but when it comes our turn to do it, it's not the easiest thing to lay down on the table and admit certain things. And so that's one of the things, at least with me and some of the collaborations I have, that's helped me going forward as well, in addition to all of these other great things.
Great. Yeah, we're going to hop back into the Zoom room then for another question. So we have one here. At Mason, we are facing a university administration that, number one, refuses to divest Mason's endowment from fossil fuel companies, and number two, takes millions of grant funding from individuals and organizations like the Charles Koch Foundation, and that also fund climate denial and climate disinformation. What should we expect from our public universities when it comes to pursuing climate justice? Should we demand that our universities' actions match our words when it comes to supporting a sustainable future?
You want?
I would just say definitely look into, and I'm sure that this person might have already started looking into this, is the divestment campaigns that have happened on college campuses. There are some great case studies of universities and how they've been able to divest not just private institutions, but also public institutions. There's also the reality of what role your alumni, your, other decision-making bodies that make up the university play. And you all are all future alumni. So you're all contributors and you can still play a role in the direction of your university. And, I think that part is key and critical. The other aspect is it's really difficult. Like, I'm not gonna fake like this is super easy, but the more that we're able to get programs invest in these environmental studies programs and other programs, initiatives on your campuses, because that creates a pipeline that leads to more opportunities for people to become the grant writers. Everyone in the environmental sector shouldn't just be professors and nonprofit organizers. We really need some folk who want to be the next head of, our energy sector, but do it right in a different way. And our institutions play a key and critical role. So even if it feels really, really daunting right now, every single one of us is playing a role in what 30 years is going to look like. So don't expect microwave action just because we live in a microwave mentality world.
I'll be short since I haven't been involved with the university for many years now. That made me sound old, but I'm not quite that old. But in my community advocacy, one of the challenges we ran into frequently, especially with development, was getting to the table, right? Because when money's involved, people really don't want to hear what you have to say if it runs contrary to them doing what they want with the money. My experience in community organizing was you always have to look for avenues and opportunities to have a megaphone to get your narrative and your voice out, and understand the processes that these entities and organizations have to go through to look for opportunities to get yourself into those processes, to be heard, to be on the record. And don't expect it's going to happen immediately, that change is going to happen, but you have to be very savvy and find those opportunities to get in there and apply pressure, and to be clear that you're always available to talk. But in a sense, sometimes you have to apply a bit of pressure, or a little bit of pain maybe, in order to bring that type of person to be a partner as opposed to an opponent.
Yeah, it's $1 million question. Really good one. AU divested about 3 or 4 years ago, and it was all the students. It was the students, writing letters, protesting, doing the math on why divestment actually made sense. Convincing the board of trustees that financially, even investing in fossil fuels in the long term is not the greatest propositions. I remember speaking outside. It was a protest board of trustees meeting. They said, "Don't speak. You're a pre-tenure professor." I was like, I don't care about that. I feel pretty strongly about this issue. And so, ultimately that happened. On the Koch brothers front, that's definitely a tough one. But I've come to realize increasingly that the university is not a kind of consensual place, right? It's an agonistic place. Like, you're going to have I'm sure I'm very much stereotyping, but you're going to have the economics department, and then you're going to have the humanities research center, right? And they're going to be very different. And so, and then and you might have the economics department taking Koch brothers money, and you might have the humanities, research center where everyone's out in the streets, right, protesting or really like doing a teach-in on social justice issues, and that's okay. I mean, Stanford has this think tank called the Hoover Institute, right? Berkeley invited like a trans-hating speaker to campus not so long ago. I mean, these things happen. And so I just think that you just have to accept that the university is a conflictual space. And that, but that it's, if you find your people and your community, and then you sort of can have those conversations and be supported, and you can make it through whatever you need to make through at the time that you're there, that counts a lot. And so that's where I would find hope, really.
Hi, so thank you very much for the great discussion and the great insights. So I wanted to go a little bit back to the first question. Yeah, it connects to the first question, and is in order to get climate justice, real climate justice, and environmental and social justice, do you all think that this can be achieved within what is referred to as social capitalism, or that the whole basis of those predatory economic systems should be completely shifted in order to achieve these things?
So this is a great question. And I think that there is, when we think about socially responsible economics, and also there's one I would actually really encourage folk to look into is regenerative economics. So Climate Justice Alliance, a lot of the framework for that organizing is based on regenerative economics, and the idea that we can create a different economic model and system, something that truly believes in protecting the margins and those who live on the margins, not just letting them flounder. A lot of that goes into some of the, and some people really don't like this term, but goes into some of the legislations and policies that are being touted as the Green New Deal. So in order to get to regenerative economics, it's going to take a just transition from where we are right now. So you'll hear that term a lot, just transition. And what does that mean? It means that we don't just want to see us switching over to, one form of energy, but then having the same injustices, or having, coal communities where there's no jobs and, people can't survive and thrive. So when as you look into some of this, people have been really diving deep into that research about what is the, how do you build that model? And it's not, regenerative economics is not necessarily a communist or even a socialist understanding, but more so something that's more in alignment with how our planet actually works. So if we're moving away from an economy that's based off of finite resources and extractive resources onto something that's based on renewable, how do we do that?
It's a big question. When I think about the conversations I've had in the community and the efforts I've been involved with and still trying to advance, in my community, so much of the economic decision making is made by people outside of that community. And one of the goals of really any of our efforts in whether dealing with development or environment or anything is finding ways to empower the community, to bring more wealth into the community, so the community has more of its own decision-making capability, more ability to shape its own future, solve its own problems without seeking resources from outside of it. So, so in a sense, it's almost like a lens through which we see all these engagements. How can we empower our people with better paying jobs? How can we empower residents in the community by creating more opportunities to build wealth through homeownership, or bring in more local businesses to contracts that they develop. They make money off of these projects, but also develop the capability to design and carry out their own projects that are informed by what the community's needs are and interests are, rather than always having to rely on people outside who often do not have the interests of the community at heart. So in a sense, we're always looking for ways to, it gets back to the resilience question. For a lot of people in the community, resilience means that we have the ability to rely on ourselves for what we need. And they point to various times where we've had a lot more local small business and everything and that was locally owned and catered to people in ways that we don't now.
I appreciate this question. Another way of framing it, which is often the subject of discussion in my courses, is, should we opt for reformism or revolution, right? And the reformism is tinkering around the edges and trying to make, your capitalist system a little bit more equitable. And then the revolution, of course, is self-explanatory. It's sort of overhauling, fundamentally some of the structures of oppression. And a South African scholar called Edgar Peterse came up with this term called radical incrementalism, which I heard him speak about once, and he lived through apartheid in South Africa, and it's basically that dialectic of keeping your eye on the long-term need for radical change, but thinking also pragmatically about what are some of the steps that can get us there, and not just a tinkering around the edges way, but in a more authentic way. Abolitionists actually call it non-reformist reforms. So Arsami Burton, my colleague, who's a historian of Black Power movements, has talked about this as non-reformist reforms, which is like, with the carceral system, there are particular ways, putting more police on the street or paying police overtime would be a kind of reform that just props up the existing carceral system, right? But whereas switching out like police being first responders for mental health crises with actual mental health responders and care responders being first responders would be a non-reformist reform, because you're actually removing the need for police intervention in more sort of in issues that don't need police intervention, or or maybe a drug rehabilitation specialist or whatever. And that would be an example of a non-reformist reform. You need those individuals who are providing care, those infrastructures of care, but you're doing it in a way that doesn't sustain a system that robs people of life chances, right? And so I've learned a lot from the abolitionist movement, because they have very pragmatic steps for how to get from the most incarcerated country in the world, right? The most incarcerated industrialized country in the world, to something that looks a little bit different. And it's a very here and now problem. So I've really learned a lot from abolitionists, and I would recommend folks, to go out and read that stuff.
Particular books or authors that people should read? I'm taking notes.
Yeah. I mean, Mariam Kaba's recent "We Do This Till We Free Us" is really great. If you look up the Critical Resistance Project, they've done quite a lot of like toolkits on this non-reformist reform. They have a great table on actually what comprises non-reformist reform. That example that I gave. So they have all the examples of like, police overtime, all this stuff, staffing police more, giving them better pays and benefits, like is just propping up the system. Whereas this kind of stuff, so they have a whole table. And I actually teach that in my classes, asking students to like, and they actually bring it back to the campus, because on the campus too, I don't know how it works at Mason, but on US campuses, over the last 10 years, they've actually cut student health services and counseling services, and it takes a long time to get an appointment for mental health screening. But as soon as you call this like care hotline or whatever, the police are right away there. So it's a switching out of social services with the police that's happening at the micro level on campuses and at the city level. And the police lobby, we all know, coming back to my earlier point, right, is extremely strong and handing gloves with the political lobby.
All right, I'm going to have to close this out with a couple of announcements. But first of all, thank you very much to Carrie, Justin, Melanie, and Tiana for this wonderful conversation, and to everybody on Zoom and in the room for your questions. So the promised announcements. So I'm Catherine Oline. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Humanities Research. I wanted to extend a warm invitation to an event that we have next week happening Friday, November 18. I'm going to go ahead and pop that in the chat. We're going to be hosting just down in Merton 1201, just down the hall, a symposium on thinking through American polarization. And I think this would be a wonderful space to continue this conversation, obviously broaden it a little bit, but I think a lot of you would get a lot out of that day. It's going to be all day, 1 to 5. And second of all, just to tease sort of next year's CHR theme, will be basically our residential fellows, and hopefully we'll have another event like this, which will treat the topic democracy, disposability, and repair, which I think is a very, very clear tie into climate justice. So I look forward to gathering again. Leah, we could invite you if you have any ISE announcements, Institute for Sustainable Earth. They are our co-hosts today. I want to make sure to give you proper credit. Anything you'd like to bring up? Okay. Thank you again. Thank you very much, everybody.